Hello and welcome to another episode of the Safe Schools Rainbow Roundtable. I'm Dr. Dan Sheridan, head psychologist of No Reservations, and I'm honored to guide today's discussion on a topic that's deeply significant and often challenging to navigate: queer grief. This episode is particularly close to my heart as we delve into the complex layers of grief experienced within the LGBTQ+ community. We will explore mental health, substance abuse, trauma, the HIV pandemic, and the intricacies of family dynamics, all through the lens of chosen family and the importance of differentiating oneself in the face of grief. Grief is a multifaceted emotion. We often think of it as the loss of loved ones, but it's present in many other aspects of our lives. Grief is the experience of moving through immense pain in response to losing something that matters deeply to us: a person, a pet, a future, or even an experience. It's the pain of longing for what we wish could be, but isn't. For many LGBTQ+ individuals, grief is intertwined with our identities and histories. We carry the weight of growing up in a world that often didn't allow us to feel safe, free, and authentic. Many of us accrued deep wounds of shame for feeling different than what the world told us we should be. As a result, we have hidden or denied our true selves, missing out on meaningful experiences that our cisgender, straight peers took for granted. This often leads us to a second adolescence in adulthood, where we must reckon with and grieve for our younger selves who grew up in an anti-queer world. Today, we will address these deeply personal and communal experiences. We'll talk about grieving for the childhood and adolescence that wasn't, and for the wounds of the childhood and adolescence that was. We'll explore how this unprocessed grief can manifest in harmful ways if not addressed, and we'll discuss healthy ways to grieve with and for our younger queer selves. But before we dive into these conversations, I'd like to introduce our incredible panelists who will be joining us today. Each bring a wealth of knowledge, personal experience, and professional expertise to our discussion. This is Julissa Reynoso, Director of Programming at the Children's Bereavement Center. Julissa is an expert on issues surrounding grief. Welcome, Julissa.
Thank you, Dan. I'm really excited to be here. I am not only the Director of Programming, I'm also a licensed mental health counselor and really excited to talk about the grief topics.
Thanks, Julissa. And we have Tiffany Williams. She is integral to the pop culture stories so important to the LGBTQ+ student and youth community. She hosts the popular podcast Tiffany Explains It All for Safe Schools. Welcome, Tiffany.
Thank you for having me. I'm really interested to see everybody's story today. I think grief is something that we're told in society we shouldn't really talk about. And so the fact that we're having this open space to talk about it, I think it's going to be very healing for not just us, but those who are watching.
Thanks, Tiffany. And we have Pastor Aaron Lauer. Aaron is the senior pastor at United Church of Christ, Fort Lauderdale. Aaron is a member of the LGBTQ+ community and provides a unique perspective for today's Safe Schools Rainbow Roundtable theme. Welcome, Aaron.
Thank you, Dan. Yes, and excited to be here with all of you talking about this important topic. For me, I worked for many years as a youth pastor and worked a lot with queer youth. So have a lot of experience of trying to navigate the loss and the grief and the challenges that they face. Just looking forward to a great conversation with you all today.
Thanks, Aaron. And we have Kyle Summers. Kyle is a teacher and school facilitator in South Florida. Welcome, Kyle.
Hey, thank you for having me, Dan. I'm looking forward to this conversation as a professional working in a space that has had to shift drastically in terms of how we maintain safe and supportive environments for queer youth. So looking forward to it.
Thanks, Kyle. And finally, we have Harold Marrero. Harold is Chief Operating Officer of Safe Schools and a pastor in South Florida. Welcome, Harold.
Thank you, Dan. I'm also very excited to be here. And this is a topic that is not just dear to my heart, but one that it's very, it's a collective thing that we all go through. So it's important to not just have the tools and the resources for us to go through it individually, but also to see how we can collectively deal with grief in a much healthier way.
Thanks, Harold. Now, let's transition to our first segment, where we'll delve into the historical context of queer grief. Understanding where we've been is crucial to understanding where we are now and where we hope to go. Grief in the LGBTQ+ community has deep roots, shaped by decades of struggle and resilience. To fully grasp the complexities of queer grief today, it's essential to look back at the historical context that has shaped our collective experience. Let's explore this history and see how it informs our present and future. In our first segment, we'll be delving into the historical context of queer grief and trauma. Understanding this context is essential to grasp the depth and nuances of the grief experienced by LGBTQ+ individuals and communities. Historically, LGBTQ+ people have faced severe oppression and violence, from being harassed and brutalized by police, jailed, or even sentenced to death for simply being who they are, to the more recent hate crimes and acts of violence, such as the murders of Islan Nettles, Mark Carson, Jorge Steven Lopez Mercado, Sakia Gunn, Malaysia Booker, Matthew Shepard, and many others. These incidents are not just isolated events, but are part of a long history of systemic oppression. One of the most significant periods of collective grief in the LGBTQ+ community was during the early years of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. Hundreds of thousands of LGBTQ+ individuals lost their lives, exacerbated by the lack of governmental response and societal indifference. This period left deep scars and a lingering sense of loss that still impacts the community today. We also observe collective trauma, where an entire community is affected psychologically by acts of violence against its members. Even if they didn't directly experience the violence, members of the community might feel symptoms such as difficulty concentrating, loss of interest in activities, or feeling unsafe. The mass shootings at queer spaces like the Pulse nightclub in Orlando and Club Q in Colorado Springs are stark reminders of this collective trauma. These tragedies reverberate throughout the community, bringing back the pain of past losses and fears for the future. It's important to note that collective trauma and historical trauma are interconnected. When a member of the community is attacked, it isn't just the immediate impact that hurts. It brings forth a flood of memories of past violence and oppression. Microaggressions, such as homophobic slurs, can trigger these deep-seated traumas, making everyday life a minefield of potential triggers. For transgender individuals, particularly Black trans women, the threat of violence is even more pronounced. The collective grief and trauma they experience are more intense due to the frequent and disproportionate targeting they face. This intersection of identities can amplify the feelings of fear and sadness, adding layers to their grief. As we consider these historical and collective traumas, it's crucial to normalize the experiences of those who are affected. Traditional trauma definitions often overlook the impact on those indirectly involved, but research has shown that the pain and fear experienced by the broader community are valid and significant. Ignoring or repressing these feelings can lead to unhealthy coping mechanisms, like substance abuse or toxic behaviors. One of the most challenging aspects of dealing with historical trauma is the ongoing nature. For marginalized communities, the trauma is not just a past event, but a continuous cycle, with new incidents reopening old wounds. This makes healing particularly difficult because the sources of trauma persist in the form of systemic oppression and recurring acts of violence. As we navigate this complex landscape, it's essential to validate the experiences of those dealing with historical and collective trauma. Listening, acknowledging their pain, and providing support are vital steps in their healing process. Every individual's reaction to trauma is unique, and their coping mechanisms will vary. Despite these challenges, the LGBTQ+ community continues to demonstrate resilience and find joy. They've learned to be vigilant, use their voices strategically, and support one another. This strength and solidarity within the community are powerful forces against ongoing oppression. Now, I'd like to open our floor to our panelists. How do you think historical and collective trauma have shaped the experiences of the queer community today? And what are some ways we can support individuals dealing with these deep-seated traumas?
Yeah, that's a lot to to cover. I mean, you covered a lot of historical events that have shaped who we are in the queer community. You know, for me personally, growing up in the 90s, in the shadow of the 80s and the AIDS crisis was very difficult. not only because of the fear of HIV, which was still very much present in the 90s, but just the whole, you have this understanding that we've lost an entire generation of people, and how hard that must have been. And would that be my story? Would that be what will encounter as I become more and more comfortable with who I am as a queer person? And those were questions that were always in my mind from middle school to high school, things that I had no control over, and nor was I well informed about because of the family situation that I grew up in. But it was just there. It was a constant little reminder of like what a possible future for me might look like.
I mean, I think about defining moments in my own life, and just hearing Matthew Shepard's name in the intro. I remember when his body was found. I remember it being a constant on the news. And I wasn't living in Wyoming. I was living in DC. I was an elementary school student. And I can remember the conversations with my grandparents just asking, wait, how did this happen? Why did it happen? Why are people so angry, right? And then seeing in 2008, the Hate Crimes Act passed in his name. And then recently, I think even a week ago, his mother, Judy Shepard, receives the National Medal of Freedom, right? And so it's this thing where I wonder, as we continue in a society that is not yet ready to live up to this idea of equality or justice or liberty for everyone, how many more Matthew Shepards we're going to see? How many more Judy Shepards are going to stand up for not just their children, but for all kids? And when are we going to decide that we've had enough?
Yeah.
I think that's a very valid point. I love, Dan, that you mentioned the ongoing aspect of this trauma. It's historical, it's ongoing. There's a lot that comes with that. There's a lot of emotional numbing that the queer community does as a way to deal with this, right? That's what leads to a lot of some negative coping mechanisms, some negative strategies. But I think it's also important to acknowledge the safety component that you're speaking about, right? If you're feeling unsafe, for whatever, financially unsafe, your environment is unsafe, you do not have the capacity to really process these traumas. So really for individuals in this community, it's so important to have a well-rounded type of support that can help them down the line maybe begin to acknowledge a lot of what's happening for them.
I think also, for me, I think when you mentioned Pulse, I remember I was in high school when it happened, and I had a lot of friends who were openly out, and they told me they were just like, I can't believe it. Like, we only have like selected few places where we feel safe, that are just like places like either a comic book store or a nightclub, places that is just dedicated for the LGBTQ plus people, like youth and young adults, and the fact that they're being targeted. And so now it's like, even now when I go out with my friends to these spaces, I'm like, I want to have fun, but I'm thinking in the back of my mind, like, what if somebody just decides that they just want to come in here and do something so horrible? And I agree with you, Kyle, like, how many more like incidences there has to be until like collectively we all decide like, okay, this is enough. Like, we can't keep doing this. Like, we all acknowledge that it's bad, but we're not putting the pieces to actually make it a better place for everyone.
Yeah. And I can just say, kind of dovetailing off of what Tiffany was talking about, from a religious perspective, I think we're probably all aware of the role that religious communities have played in homophobia and transphobia, in creating a society, here in the United States and really now all over the world, where queer people are not welcomed in our spaces. And, you want to talk about compounding grief, especially historically. If you look at a religious community, it's like, what does a religious community provide? What does faith provide? It provides, access and connection to God, or whatever, deeper truth or universal spirit you may be praying to. It provides a sense of community and support for that. It also, for so many people, religion is a part of their family. And when you get cut out of that identity with your family, you see that there aren't those places of support for you. So I think as a pastor, and a queer pastor and a pastor of a church that is primarily queer, I think it is so important that we really stand up and be a loud voice of welcome for people, because I can't tell you the number of people who come into my office and say, I was hurt by the church and I'm just looking for a safe place to be. Mm-hmm. And, we want to be that. Dan, going back to the point you made earlier about queer resilience, I think that's another important thing too. It's like these faith communities tried to take our faith from us. They tried to take our spirituality from us. And there's a lot of queer people throughout history who said, no, you're not going to take it from me. My denomination, we ordained the first openly gay pastor back in 1972. Bill Johnson was his name, and he stood up and he said, I'm not going to let a church or a religion tell me that I don't have access to God and that I don't have a call to leadership. And a lot of queer people create their own religious traditions, and their own religious rituals in their own religious communities. And I think that's so important that, queer people stand up and say, our faith is important, our spirituality is important, and we're going to continue to access that and to create spaces for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that there's something to be said about the fact that the church did fail, or religious communities did fail the queer community, particularly during the 80s and during the AIDS crisis. I mean, I think about, this is something that's always in my head for some reason, that my own fear of having to die alone in a hospital bed without anybody there, without having my pastor, my priests, the people that were important to me, the things that connected me to something broader and larger than who I am, being denied that. I'm being denied, then being denied my family, then being, my friends couldn't come and see me because nobody knew what was happening. No one knew how it was spread, especially in the early times of the AIDS crisis. And I wonder if, for us to have some collective healing, is that something that maybe we should look at again, or reopen that in a way that there's healing for it? That the church can do something that, I don't know, that says we're sorry, but also like here is the space that we should have given, your friends, your families, your those that were suffering, because that was a very dark time for the gay community and for a lot of people, because if it wasn't just queer people that were being affected, it's their friends, their family members, people that were important to them. So I don't know. I'm happy that the church has come a long way, and I'm happy that we have, we're getting to this point, and society has come a long way as well. But there's still so much to be spoken about, particularly when grief is something that we don't talk about, period. Not just in the queer community, but in other spaces. And I think that queer resilience is something, like you said, Erin, that we do create on our own because we have to. We're forced to create that resilience. We're forced to be there for one another. And I'm grateful that we do that, but I also think that there's so much more healing that needs to be done.
I love that, Harold. I think that you're touching on such a larger topic of trust in the queer community. How can you trust a particular space, whether it's a church space, where there is a medical center? How can you come in and trust when so many people that were supposed to be there for you have let you down, right? There's a lot of grief in that in itself. And when you talk a lot about the resilience, I love resilience, and similar to you, as you were saying, it also to me, it means like you're continuing to fight through all of these things, and you haven't taken a time to really sit with it, because you cannot. You have to continue to move forward with it, and it's so devastating for people to go through that. But I think trust is so crucial. So how do we build that trust? You know, in our organization, at CBC, we really try to build that trust by bringing in folks from the queer community, by connecting with other community organizations that are very present and very trusting of that organization. So I think that continued work, we all need to stay connected. It's so cliche. It takes a village, but it really does.
Yeah.
There's even like now, I think like the last school I went to go visit was in a not so great neighborhood. And I mean, they were just surprised that somebody came out to like go see them and talk to them. And interesting enough, our conversation went around, I was like, oh, what's something you want to talk about? And they were like, oh, church. And I was like, okay, like what do you want to talk about? And a lot of their concerns are the same thing. They're like, you know, they are religious, but they feel like they have to choose between being LGBTQ plus or being faithful, you know, and they just kind of wish that their parents weren't so rigid to like one side of that meter. So they're also afraid of like telling their parents like, yeah, I'm actually gay. And they're going to be like, oh, no, you're not, you know? And I think another thing that they had mentioned to me, they basically just wish that their own pastors could just be like, that's okay. And like, we welcome you. And like, you're not like a pariah, like you're not shunned. And it's really difficult for them. And they just really have a hard time. And especially like they all mentioned, they're like, we know we don't live in the best neighborhood. And, you know, our churches are a lot more like old school. I'm like, I know, but it usually takes one person to kind of start making that change. And of course, they're all like high schoolers. So they're kind of like, I mean, you're saying all the right things, but I don't want to be that person, you know? And I'm like, you know, it just made me realize, I was like, maybe there's something I know not every teenager is like religious, but for those who are like faithful and they're looking for those spaces, I feel like, you know, trying to see how do we connect these kids together? How do we kind of heal them? Because a lot of them feel ashamed for being who they are. And they just want to be able to be both and not have to choose.
Yeah, if I can go back to something, Julissa, that you said, that when you talk about, you know, those like communities of support, you know, in pastoral care, we always talk about, you know, how do we get people to sit with their grief, to be in touch with their grief and get over the fear basically that prevents them from doing that. And a lot of times the fear is like, I'm going to get into my grief and there's going to be nothing there to support me when I'm there. And when you're told that God isn't going to be there to support you and you don't have a community there to support you, yeah, people are not able to access that. So I agree. I really think that faith communities, the queer community in general, how do we come together and create spaces where people can be held, where they can access their grief, and where they can be healed through that process? Yeah, that's kind of a challenge for us as a wider community, I think.
I think that's a great question that we can dive into more in the next segment. But I want to move us on and transition to our next segment, where we'll be hearing real-life experiences of grief and resilience within the queer community. We'll explore how chosen families and self-differentiation play crucial roles in dealing with all forms of grief, loss, and trauma. In this segment, we'll explore real-life experiences of grief and resilience within the queer community. Through these stories, we'll delve into the concepts of complicated grief, the significance of pets for LGBTQ+ individuals, and the crucial role of chosen family in the grieving process. Let's start with the story of Alex, a young non-binary person who recently lost their beloved dog, Max. Pets often hold a special place in our hearts, providing unconditional love and companionship. For many queer individuals, pets are more than just animals. They're family. When Alex lost Max, they felt an overwhelming sense of grief. Max had been a constant source of comfort and acceptance, especially during difficult times when Alex faced rejection from their biological family. As Alex navigated this loss, their chosen family, friends who understood and accepted them, became a vital support system. They shared stories of Max, cried together, and celebrated his memory. This support helped Alex process their grief and find ways to honor Max's legacy, illustrating the importance of chosen family in the healing journey. Next, we have the story of Jordan, a gay man who recently lost his partner Michael due to a sudden illness. Jordan and Michael had been together for over a decade, and their bond was incredibly strong. Michael's death left Jordan devastated, grappling with not only the loss of his partner, but also the compounded grief of past traumas, including the AIDS crisis. Jordan found himself mourning not just Michael, but also the friends and loved ones he'd lost in the past. Jordan's chosen family played a crucial role in his healing process. They provided a safe space for him to express his emotions, shared memories of Michael, and helped him navigate the practical challenges that followed Michael's passing. Through their support, Jordan began to address his long-buried grief from the AIDS crisis, finding a sense of closure and peace he hadn't known before. Tanya, a transgender woman, shares her story of losing her close friend Lisa to violence nearly 20 years ago. Every time news breaks about another trans person being killed, Tanya feels a deep, visceral pain. This ongoing grief is compounded by the constant threat of violence she and her community face. The loss of Lisa was a defining moment in Tanya's life, shaping her understanding of grief and resilience. Tanya's chosen family has been instrumental in her journey. They have stood by her side through candlelight vigils, memorials, and the everyday challenges of being a trans woman in a hostile world. Their support has given Tanya the strength to continue advocating for her community and honoring Lisa's memory. Saffron, a lesbian who lost her partner of 26 years to cancer, shares how her grief was compounded by societal challenges. Despite their long relationship, Saffron often had to explain her marriage to hospital staff and deal with insensitive comments. This added layer of complexity to her grief, making it even more difficult to navigate. Saffron found solace in connecting with other widows and widowers online. Hosting Twitter spaces and writing about her experiences allowed her to process her grief and offer support to others in similar situations. Through this, Saffron highlights the importance of community and shared experiences in the healing process. Each of these stories highlights the unique challenges and resilience of the LGBTQ+ community in dealing with grief. They show how chosen families can provide the emotional support and understanding that biological families sometimes cannot. So to our panelists, how have you seen chosen families help individuals navigate grief in your experiences or work? And what are some ways that we can support someone who's dealing with the loss of a pet, a partner, or a friend, especially when they face societal challenges as well?
Well, I mean, I can speak from very personal point of view, where recently I just lost my pet. Her name is Kira. She was with me since from my early 20s, and she was that constant. She was a constant part of my life through a lot of changes in my life. She was the one family member that I had that I felt unconditional love with and for, and that loved me as well, more than my own family. And her death hit me very hard, and I think it, not just because she's my pet, she was like, my family member, but because she was so integrated into my life, into who I was. And I had to fight the thoughts of like, maybe I shouldn't be grieving so hard because she was only a dog, because that was like the expectations, like that's something that I hear a lot. And even like I had to silence my own family members, particularly my father, because he once said something to me in terms of like, what do you have in life? All you have is a dog. And that hurt me so much because she's so much more than a dog to me. She's like, she's like a daughter. She's like a child. And he meant it in a very awful and horrible way. And when she died and he would call me, I just didn't answer the phone because he doesn't get to sit with me. He doesn't get to support me because he didn't support me, period, throughout her life. So I didn't feel the need to answer that phone call, and I haven't answered the phone call. And others in my immediate family and my chosen family, they reached out, but it's just hard. It's hard to lose some, and when in the earlier segments we talked about the the feelings of wanting something that cannot be, that can never be again. And that to me is hard because her presence is still there in the house. Like you can sense it, you can see it. It took me a while to remove her stuff and to put stuff away. And I took my time with it. When people were telling me like, "Oh, just move on," like, take her stuff away. I'm like, no, I'm gonna sit there. I'm gonna be with it as long as I can. And when I feel ready, then I will remove her things, and I will keep memories of her alive in different spots, in my time.
Yeah, I think you're speaking really to that grief and that grief process and experience that is very different for everybody, right? Especially in the queer community. There is a lot of shame and guilt that can come in grieving. Should I be grieving this heavily? Is it worth? Is this person? That society may say, really, this person is not even worth to be grieved, and that is such a sad thing. So I think the chosen family comes in. We see a lot of that in our support groups, where people really come in and validate your grief is your own, your experience is your own, and it's okay to do with it whatever you want, right? Just sitting with someone can be enough to provide that support, but having an understanding of the complexities that come about in the queer community regarding their own grief, I think that's where the chosen family is so crucial, right? They understand that, right? They understand that component and they are ready to go. I've seen people mobilize so quickly to help support someone who is really in need, and it's so beautiful.
And also that a support group can become a chosen family for people who don't have support in biological families or rural communities. And I think it's wonderful that the CBC, for example, offers online support groups. It's making it national or international.
Yeah, international at this point.
Yeah, and I love that the CBC also, like you said, Dan, they do become a chosen family, and the people in those groups become the ones that you lean into, that you cry with, that you engage in sometimes conversations that you feel like your own family is too much for them. And it could be like there's times that people don't want to engage with grief because they feel they don't know what to say. They're gonna say the wrong thing. It's a lot of reasons, but having places like the CBC and other spaces where you are allowed to just sit there and be around people who understand, who are there for you to sit there and just be, is so important for collective healing and for, personal and collective healing as well.
A lot of our participants actually really mentioned that. They say, I have been putting on this strong face throughout the week, right? Because people expect me to act a certain way. I have a lot of things to handle. I have funeral things to handle. When I come into the grief support groups that CBC provides, I am able to let that facade go and just whatever comes out, letting it be. And I think we all need spaces like that.
Yeah, I think, again, speaking as a pastor, I think religious communities provide a unique kind of space for this grieving. Because I think there are definitely times in our lives, especially as queer people, where we need like a self-differentiated person, to sit with us and to help us through the process of grieving, and then or a self-differentiated community as well. But I also think, a lot of times in faith communities, when someone passes, for example, or there's a loss in the wider community, or there's some major change, it's like we're all grieving together. And we get to sit in this moment together, and we get to support one another. And people who have been here before get to be the leaders in helping us through it. I think there's a real generative power to grief. And if it's done right, grief can not only be healing, but we can come out the other side. Yes, we're wounded, but like we wear those wounds as like a sign of survival. And we're better for it. There's a great quote that I go to a lot when I talk about grief, and it's this priest, Henry Nouwen. He says that you can't be led out of the desert by someone who's never been there before. And so I think that when we are in those spaces where it's like you have a grief partner almost who's like, for example, we had a youth at my previous church who died by suicide, and his family was going through intense grief. We were able to connect that family with another family who had experienced the same thing, and they were able to work through that process together. And just seeing how that happened and the generative power of that was really, really important.
I was going to say also schools provide that same space too.
Yeah.
I've seen it with like GSA sponsors with their kids. And it's really interesting because everyone has experienced grief, at least in their youth, you know, in one shape or form. And it is hard. It's hard as adults to try to like openly be like, yeah, I'm going through it and I'm going to show my emotions willingly. For a teenager, it's like even like super more intense because you just don't want to feel like that weirdo that's sitting in the classroom that's crying and everybody's just kind of like, what's wrong with you? You know, but a lot of these teachers, you know, sometimes they're really like surprised that sometimes a student will just come up to them and tell them like, hey, I'm going through this. And they're like, they've told me personally, they're like, I don't know what to say. I want to be supportive, but I'm also like, I want to be like, in case they are at a point where they do need like medical assistance, they need help, they need guidance. How do I do that without making them feel like I'm outing them? How do I kind of like go about this? How do I help them? And I'm like, most of the time it's just having somebody there, knowing that they can go to you. You know, I think it's I'm all about transparency. So you obviously as a teacher or as a guidance counselor or even a mentor, somebody you look up to be like, look, I care about you. I may not know you personally, but I care about you. But if I see that you need like more help than I can provide, I'm going to help you the best way I can. And it's not anything against you. I just want to care for your safety, you know, because that's where a lot of these youths feel like they don't have that person they can go to. And it becomes so overwhelming. And then they do things and then people are like, oh my God, I can't believe this happened. And it's like, yeah, because they just didn't feel safe. And they didn't feel like there was somebody they can go to talk about these heavy things. Or I know when I was a teenager, my parents would tell me, they're like, you have it easy. Like, what do you have to worry about? You just go to school. You don't pay bills. You don't do. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, you're invalidating your child's experience at school. Like, I think we all remember high school. We all remember middle school. Like, those were not fun times. They were hard. And because everybody else is going through their own thing. And then it's like, who is the weakest link? Because we all know there's always that one bully that wants to like go after that one kid for no apparent reason. And one of the biggest things I always tell these kids, I'm like, if you see something, especially the kids that go to these GSA clubs that are allies, they're not part of the community, but they're allies. I'm like, if you see something within your own personal group, like stand up for those kids. They're like, oh, but I don't want to lose them. I'm like, you are better off losing one shitty friend and gaining a whole plethora of like better friends, you know? And it's just that more being upfront more, being that like voice, being that person to step forward and be like, I don't care what anyone thinks. I don't care what anyone else's opinion is. Like, what you're doing is wrong. And I want to support the person that needs it the most.
Yeah.
No, I think, Tiffany, to your point, working in education for the better part of a decade at this point, I want to honor the anger that our young people feel, the sense of abandon that many teachers feel, because for the better part of the last 10 years in the Tri-County area, we as educators were allowed to affirm the identities of our kids. Even if in doing so, we were at an exact point of opposite of their parents and families. And so for our young people who literally woke up July 1st to a world where we couldn't use affirmed names anymore, to a world where we couldn't just let them use the bathroom, right? We had teachers who said, well, wait, what do I do now? And what do I do now in a state where we are required to be certified as youth mental health first aiders, where we're told to look for signs and symptoms and hold space and support kids? But how do we do that when there's a lack of clarity around what I now have to do with that information? And so for many of the club sponsors that I support, they will say, I just am in the room and let the kids talk. I don't say anything. I don't prompt anything, because heaven forbid I say or I prompt something and now I have this information and what do I do with it? The fear around queer youth coming to us and just saying, I need help right now. Well, what does that mean, right? For those of us who are willing to do the thing that's right and say, well, what do you mean? But what does help look like right now? Are you thinking about killing yourself? Are you contemplating suicide? Do you have a plan, right? That's a really difficult conversation to engage with. And if you're in a space of, I am afraid of asking the question, what happens when you say nothing, right? And I think to your point about students, I immediately think about Sylvia Rivera shouting at the crowd saying, how dare you ignore the experience of trans people, but you want me to fight for you, right? Like, how do we get more young people on board to say, I might not be your friend, but like, I'm glad that you're here and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow, right? There's a collective responsibility. And until we are ready to own the anger that goes with that, I don't think we can fully grieve. We're not going to be able to fully process any of this.
Absolutely. I mean, grief really becomes a social justice issue. That, to have a space where we can talk about the things we need to talk about without fear of repercussion, because we're all grieving. That is a fundamental human experience is grief in all forms. And the only way to live fully, to be our most authentic self, is to honor our grief, individually and collectively. So we have a lot of work ahead of us, especially in Florida.
Oh, yeah.
But we have to move on to the next segment where these stories and experiences underscore the importance of community and support in the grieving process. As we transition to our next segment, we'll explore practical tools and resources for healthy grief practices. We'll look at how allowing oneself to fully feel their emotions and avoiding placing a timeline on grief can aid in healing. We'll also discuss community resources available for bereavement and how these organizations can help individuals through their grieving journey. In this segment, we'll discuss practical tools and resources for dealing with grief in healthy ways. We've heard powerful stories of grief and resilience within the queer community, and now it's time to explore how we can support each other through these challenging times. Grief is a deeply personal experience, and for many queer individuals, it's compounded by societal challenges. One such challenge is disenfranchised grief. This occurs when a person's grief is not acknowledged or supported by their community. For example, same-sex partners may be excluded from the grieving process, referred to as a quote-unquote friend rather than a spouse, or even forced to sit at the back of their partner's funeral. This exclusion can make the grieving process even more difficult and have long-term impacts on mental health. Misgendering is another significant issue for trans and non-binary individuals. In death, as in life, they may face barriers to having their gender identity recognized. Misgendering or dead naming by healthcare workers or funeral practitioners can be particularly distressing for friends and family at a time when they're already vulnerable. Chosen families play a crucial role in supporting queer individuals through grief. Members of the queer community often rely on close networks of friends rather than biological relatives. These chosen families provide emotional support, help with funeral planning, and ensure that their loved ones are remembered and honored in meaningful ways. Let's also address the concept of complicated grief, also known as prolonged grief disorder. This occurs when someone becomes stuck in their grief, unable to cope with life many months after a loss. It's more likely to happen if the death was sudden, traumatic, or unexpected. Complicated grief can manifest in various ways, such as feeling stuck in sadness, not coping with daily life, or finding no enjoyment in activities. So, how can we support someone experiencing complicated grief? Here are a few strategies that have been found to be helpful. Keeping a steady routine. Maintaining regular habits such as eating and sleeping at consistent times can provide a sense of stability during a turbulent period. Self-compassion. Encourage those grieving to be kind to themselves. It's okay to feel happiness amidst grief, and small activities that bring joy can be very beneficial. Talking to friends, family, or community. Finding safe and trusted individuals to share feelings with can help normalize the grief experience and reduce feelings of isolation. Support groups, whether in person or online, can also be a valuable resource. Here in South Florida, the Children's Bereavement Center and its adult division, Lift from Loss, offers free peer support groups for individuals who have lost a loved one. These groups are open to anyone who has experienced a loss, whether recent or in the past, and those support groups are available in English, Spanish, and Creole, and provide a space for sharing experiences and finding comfort in community. The Children's Bereavement Center's mission is to empower children, young adults, and their families to adjust to life after the loss of a loved one. Their vision is to restore hope for the future and establish their peer support model as the best practice for child and family bereavement services. Their healthful grieving model includes principles such as acknowledging that grief is a normal, natural process and that people have the ability to heal at their own pace. A caring environment and the camaraderie among grieving individuals play vital roles in the healing process. The group experience helps participants regain a sense of control and empowerment, increase awareness of available resources, and maintain self-esteem and trust in others. As we consider these resources and strategies, I'd like to ask our panelists, what are some specific tools or practices you have found helpful in supporting those dealing with grief? And how can we create more inclusive and supportive environments for queer individuals navigating bereavement?
I think it's important to really make those connections with other organizations that have really great resources for the queer community, especially when they're after a loss. Everything can feel so destabilizing, right? And people may not have funeral services that might be queer friendly, spiritual services, therapists. So making sure to be intentional in collecting that information to provide to the community when it's in need. I can't speak highly about that because you don't want to refer somebody to a person or a place where they're not going to be welcomed and they don't understand the different dynamics affecting the queer community.
I'd just like to echo that sentiment, understanding that not all organizations can support queer folk in the right ways, despite having the best intentions, right? I think about, in particular, our queer and our non-binary and trans youth. Something that I have sort of discussed, argued, fought over with the administration in the school system that I work for is the idea of an ID. So student IDs, according to legal counsel for the district that I work for, constitute a legal document. Well, fine. But for our non-binary and trans youth who now use affirming and chosen names, what does that need to look like for them when the purpose of a student ID is not so that I can identify you across the room? It's, should something happen, I can identify your body. So what does that look like for a trans kid who has now been in a tragedy? How do we as school administrators make that call to a parent? Who am I identifying? How am I reopening wounds in a moment that is one of the most painful?
Yeah. I think that's so great to talk about. I think the people's level of comfort regarding situations like that, we really need more training around that. We really need more education, and we also need to confront our own issues with grief and trauma.
Absolutely.
So CBC really, Dan did a great introduction about what the Children's Bereavement Center does in helping not just children and adults process grief and loss, but we also do trainings in the community to help everybody, not just mental health professionals, really feel comfortable with what does that look like? What is grief, right? And how can you help support individuals in the school system, kids in the school system that are grieving, that are processing trauma.
I mean, even with our parents, I think about PFLAG, right? If we are honest, for many parents of queer youth, the anger that they feel that leads to them disowning their children is they've lost the kid that they thought they had.
Yes.
They're losing the future that they thought that that baby was going to have. And unless we meet them where they are and let them know that is okay. It is okay for you to be afraid for your child. It is okay that they are now finding themselves, guess what? You get to have a different kid.
But they have to grieve.
Right. They have to grieve. They have to say, I'm okay with losing who I thought my kid was. And now I have such this beautiful opportunity to get to know this new person. But if we don't address grief, that never gets to happen. They just sit in that anger.
Yeah, I love that you brought that in, because grief is not just something that happens when you lose someone, when someone dies. Grief has many layers and many aspects. You know, like you said, a parent, when a child comes out, the parent does have to grieve the fact that all the expectations that they had on that child are now dead. There's a dead child in the room, and that's complicated. And I think that our own societal misunderstandings of grief and inability to grieve compounds to that issue, and it adds, layers to how can I now deal with this, and even beyond that, even our own, we talked about how growing up, at least for me, I was never allowed to be me. I was always this lie of someone else. I was always this person that wasn't me. And recently I was walking my dog, we have a golden retriever. I was walking him, he pulls me. And I was just thinking, and I saw a kid going to prom. He was well dressed, going to prom. And I'm like, oh yeah, I remember doing that. But then I started thinking to myself, was I ever happy? And this realization set in that it's like, no, I was never happy in high school. There was always this deep sense of sadness that I was always lying to everyone around me and lying to myself because I couldn't be myself. So how much of that, obviously that has, that comes up with you, and it hits you in your 20s and your 30s, and as you grow, and as you're processing this as you grow up. But for me, it's almost like I wish there was something that I could have done to be like, I'm going to grieve this person that never was. I'm going to sit there and not feel sorry for myself, but totally meet that part of me in this space and say, I'm so sorry that happened to you.
Yes, absolutely. I also, on the flip end of that, I think we all have to sit with that, with the grief of what we wish it would have been. But I have seen how the queer community really has tried to heal from that. I recently attended a queer prom, and it was so beautiful. It was amazing and so healing for people to really be themselves finally in something that maybe they initially weren't able to. And that's just one aspect of it. There's so many other ways that people are trying to, yes, process that grief and sit with it, but also heal and move forward with it. Because we do not, it's not something that you get over. Grief is not something you get over. It's something you move forward with, right? And sometimes it can feel very intense, sometimes not so heavy. And the way that we choose to move forward in that healing process can be very beautiful.
Yeah, I have actually a little story. So this was maybe I want to say a month or so. I went to go visit a friend in North Carolina, and she was like, let's go to the local drag show. I was like, awesome, let's go. And we're going, and we've all gone to drag brunch, I'm assuming. We all know it's usually sometimes a pageant show because you got the most glamorous outfits, boas, feathers, all that. But there was this one queen that she was different. And the best way to describe her drag is an acid trip, like literally an acid trip. She was, I mean, her makeup looked more like war paint, and she had like this muumuu, and she had like this big clown curly like hair. Like she was just like out there. But she had all these pearls. I mean, adorned. Like I'm talking about like it was like covering half of her body. And she had bracelets and earrings and rings. And everyone at the brunch, I could tell they were kind of just like, oh, okay. And even the songs that she had selected were more like 70s rock, Queen, but not the usual stuff that you would see in a show. And I was like, I feel like there's something more to her story. And sure enough, at the end of the show, the MC was like, oh, this is my good friend Pearl. And she explains why her drag is the way it is. And she says that the necklaces that she's wearing are not even all her pearls. She has giant bowls at home just filled to the brim with pearls. And she says, these are all my friends I lost during the HIV and AIDS pandemic. Oh. Each single strand of pearls she gave to her friends at the hospital, and those were given back to her. And she had said she's been clear for many years that she's HIV free, but she holds on to these pearls as her grieving process. And she says, I wear these for my friends who didn't make it, and I take them everywhere I go with me. And I tell you, like, there was not a dry eye in the house. Everyone was sobbing. And I was just like, I had one of my friends had brought her friends, and she had told us, she's like, oh, I didn't really like her drag before she had told her story. And then afterwards, she was like, I kind of feel bad. I didn't know. And I'm like, well, you can't really judge a book by its cover. And this is how she grieves her friends. She takes them physically with her in her performance. And I just thought that was so, so beautiful, you know?
It really speaks to the power of art and creative practices in grieving, and that we could all grieve in different ways and just share these different types of techniques to help each other. But we have to move on to our next section. I want to thank you for your insights. And it's clear that while grief is a personal journey, having the right support and resources can make a significant difference. As we transition to our final segment, The Future Outlook, we'll explore a hopeful future for the queer community when it comes to grief and support. We'll discuss how we can continue to build a more inclusive, understanding, and supportive environment for everyone. As we conclude our discussion today, we'll explore a hopeful future where queer grief is shared and held within communities that are curated to care for individuals throughout their lives. These communities can take many forms: faith-based groups, chosen families, or even specially designed networks that reflect all aspects of our humanity. Imagine a world where grief is not an isolated experience, but one shared and supported by a compassionate community. In such communities, we see the importance of intergenerational dialogues that foster shared wisdom and support among queer kinship. These dialogues allow for the exchange of experiences and knowledge, helping to bridge the gap between different generations and creating a stronger, more resilient community. One of the best things we can do as individuals is to learn how to become more self-differentiated. Self-differentiation allows us to open space in our hearts and minds for others, by freeing ourselves from the toxic elements of problematic families and friendships. It's about loving ourselves, not selfishly, but in a way that makes us aware of what holds us back from authentically connecting with others. This awareness enables us to be vulnerable and to hold space for others going through grief, even when that space feels heavy and sad. Communities that nurture self-differentiation encourage individuals to explore their identities and emotions fully. This exploration leads to deeper connections and a more profound understanding of one another. It also empowers individuals to support each other through all of life's challenges, including grief. So to our panelists, how do you see communities evolving to better support queer individuals through grief? And what role does self-differentiation play in creating these supportive environments?
You know, that's a great question. And recently, as I was doing a kind of like a get together that was supposed to be like a worship service for a church, and something that I realized as I was, I wrote something that for people to read and for us to go through it together, and it was about forgiveness, and it was about moving into a state of forgiveness. But then after the service, I sat with it. I'm like, that didn't feel good for me, because I realized that for so long I grew up in a church environment that wanted me to move very quickly towards forgiveness, wanted me to move really quickly away from my anger, wanted me to be pacified. And I think that many aspects of particularly Christianity that do that. They want you to move into that state, go quickly from A to B. And as I was thinking about it later on, I was like, that felt gross, because there are some things that people just cannot forgive, and they shouldn't forgive. They can forgive themselves. They can have enormous sense of love for themselves, but there are some things that you just can't really get past, and you shouldn't get past, and you shouldn't try to seek reparations with whoever hurt you or whatever happened to you. And that was a huge wake-up call for me, because I was like, as I continue this process to try to create community for people, I want to create a community that allows people to just sit there with their grief, with their anger, with their sense of not being able to forgive yet or ever, and that's okay. And find ways that to support them so that they can feel love, so that they can feel their own internal love and internal forgiveness, or internal liberation from anger, but also affirm them and give them that space. And I think too many times religious organizations and even families, they just want you to move on. They just want you to get better at all costs. And it's like, yeah, but it takes time. And I feel like community should do better at that. Should be better at sitting there and allowing people to just sit.
And what does get better even mean?
Right. Yeah.
What does that mean? People go through a lot of trauma, a lot of grief, and that changes you. It just really changes you. You are no longer going to be the person you were before. And for a lot of grievers, they really, I just want to be what I was before. I want to go back, a lot of times people say, I just want to go back to normal. What does that even look like? You have experienced a traumatic loss. It's okay that it has changed you. And now you just have to know what that looks like moving forward, what you want it to be. I think it's very powerful when people take that and they make something amazing. I have seen our grief group participants at the Children's Bereavement Center really go into volunteering, because maybe the person that died of cancer. Now they're helping those who are in cancer. Maybe they delve in more into their spirituality and they want to help other people in that way. So there's many ways to move forward with that, but to getting better, it just stayed with me. Like you just said. Thank you for sharing that, though.
I think that's even the biggest thing is how do you quote unquote heal during that grieving process? And for some people that might be, talking to somebody. It might be, volunteering like you mentioned, or diving into, an artistic endeavor, or even going to a rage room and just breaking stuff and having that moment to experience those feelings, to let it have its moment, and know that in grieving and the process of grieving, you might be, great one day and you feel like, things are starting to get better. And then all of a sudden somebody gives you, a bar of chocolate that was a person who passed away that used to give it to you all the time. And then all of a sudden you're crying with a bar of chocolate in your hand, it's something that's silly, but not silly, but something would seem so small that could bring you back to that moment, to live in that moment. And I think a lot of people, I agree that they just want to tell you just get better. You'll get through it, but you can't be there the whole time. And it's emotions don't understand the premise of time. They need to exist. So the more you keep repressing them, the more they're just going to get intensified until the point that you're calling out for a whole week because you're I can't do this right now. You can't do that. So being able to have multiple different tools to express that grief is so crucial, not just to like adults, but also to like teens and children that are going through that. And also to not invalidate the kids when they say, I'm angry or I'm sad or I'm going through it, and not being like, you're a kid. It's like, yeah, a kid in this 24th century, like, is really hard, really difficult. And it's just letting people to have that space, to allow that space to be there.
I think that speaks to the again, to the lack of comfort people feel around grief on the topic. And so we really do provide a lot of, at CVC, we provide a lot of education, not just for professionals, but also to the community, right? And what are some healing tools, or what are some things that you can really use yourself in helping a person that's grieving?
I think such an important piece of this is that the desire to fix grief often stems from one's own discomfort with grief. When you move to, let's just move past this, let's just hear some strategies, let's just move forward, the person themselves are struggling with their own maybe historical grief, their own emotions surrounding loss. And the best thing to do is to be with someone, to sit with them, to say, how can I support you? Not to give them strategies, but ask them what would be most helpful for you. Mm-hmm. And I think in the long-term way of helping people with grief and the community with grief, I like to think about, hurricane preparedness. June is upon us. We get our supplies, we get ready. We don't want to search for supplies in a panic moment. It's not going to be there. We're going to make bad decisions. So really preparation, like how can we partner with the Children's Bereavement Center ahead of time, know the resources that they have. What other auxiliary resources are there in the event that a church member passes away, a student passes away at school, that we're prepared and that we know what to say in the event of a crisis, that our grief is handled, that we're not overcome by our own loss, that our personal work has been worked on or in the process. So let's not react in crisis, but to be with people as much as we can.
Yeah.
So that wraps up today's session at the Rainbow Roundtable. It's been inspiring to hear about the potential for communities to grow and adapt in ways that truly support their members. As we look to the future, it's clear that fostering supportive, inclusive communities is essential. These communities not only provide comfort during times of grief, but also enrich our lives through shared experiences and mutual support. By engaging in intergenerational dialogues and cultivating self-differentiation, we can create spaces where everyone feels valued and understood. Let's remember that our individual journeys towards self-awareness and self-love are crucial. They help us break free from negative influences and open our hearts to genuine connections. This work, while deeply personal, has a profound impact on the wider community. As we wrap up today's discussion, I want to thank our panelists for their invaluable insights. Your contributions have been enlightening and deeply appreciated. And to our audience, thank you for joining us. If you're inspired by our discussions and the work of Safe Schools, we encourage you to subscribe and learn more about what we do to protect and educate queer youth, educators, and the modern families that make up America. Your support through donations or volunteering at events helps us continue our mission. A special thank you to our sponsors, the Quadracci Family Foundation. Led by Richard Quadracci, he has been a trusted friend to queer students and youth across South Florida, and the foundation is a unique supporter of the many, many issues that queer youth face in the hostile environment in Florida. A special thank you to our sponsors, the AIDS Healthcare Foundation and the Florida AIDS Walk. AHF is keenly aware of the special challenges queer youth and students face over HIV, healthcare, and mental health. The step up to those challenges by making Safe Schools a recipient of the Florida AIDS Walk, one of the largest queer-supported fundraisers in America. Children's Trust looks for new and innovative ways to support the youth and student communities in South Florida. And this program is proof positive of the goal, where you can hear the kind of conversation about queer students and youth like you heard from Safe Schools Rainbow Roundtable. That is made possible by the Children's Trust of Miami. And our special partners at Happening Out Television Network. A professional broadcast like this is not possible without their support. Hotspots Magazine Happening Out television network is the largest LGBTQ+ media nonprofit in America, and we are so grateful they are based right here in South Florida. All of these partners are instrumental to our endeavor to create a safer, more inclusive world for queer youth. Thank you for joining us on Safe Schools Rainbow Roundtable. Stay safe, stay informed, and keep advocating for inclusivity and equality. Until next time, keep shining your rainbow light in all you do. Thank you, and see you next time at the Safe Schools Rainbow Roundtable.